Welcome to the Lit Fiction Podcast, your guide to insightful short story analysis with a New Yorker fiction focus. Our blend of scholarly depth and relatability makes literature accessible to everyone. Welcome to the Lit Fiction Podcast. I'm your host, Colin. I'm joined with Jennifer, and on today's episode, we are going to discuss One Christmas Eve, a short story by Langston Hughes. One Christmas Eve follows Arcee, a black housekeeper, as she tries to create a simple Christmas for her young son, Joe, despite financial hardship and racial discrimination. After work, she takes Joe downtown to shop and see the festive displays. While waiting outside a store, Joe wanders into a whites-only theater lobby where he sees Santa Claus but is mocked and frightened by the Santa instead of welcome. Arcee scolds Joe for straying, but consoles him, explaining that the man she saw was not a true Santa Claus. The story underscores the impact of racism on innocence and the strength of a mother's love. So I'm just going to give a quick bio on Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was born in 1901 and died in 1967. He was from Joplin, Missouri, and he was an innovator of jazz poetry. He was also a leader of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a artistic movement, or specifically writing movement, in Harlem in the 1920s, also associated with Jean Toomer and later Zora Neale Hurston and other writers. Langston Hughes moved to New York City as a young man, made his career there as a writer. He, of course, published poetry. The Weary Blues was first published in 1926. He also wrote plays, short stories, novels, and nonfiction work. His first short story collection, The Ways of White Folks, features 14 stories, and these were inspired by his experiences and those of other people he met. And it focuses on multiple dimensions of racial issues. So this is primarily from Wikipedia, by the way. So if you want to read a little bit more, you can check that out. And one of the stories, One Christmas Eve, of course, today's story, is featured in that collection. And I picked this up a few days ago. This was my first time reading Langston Hughes, and I really enjoyed this story. So I'm looking forward to reading more. So why don't we go around and just get some first impressions?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. So we have not yet explored on lit fiction anything from the Harlem Renaissance. So this felt like a very interesting timestamp for me. We just last week spoke about Virginia Woolf's essay that was written in 1927. So kind of just thinking about what was going on in the world in the 20s. So I thought this was a very atypical, in some ways, Christmas story. I really wanted a beautiful, happy ending. I wanted all of the stereotypical things that one would get from a feel good Christmas story. And this story was actually the opposite. And what really jumped out for me was the lack of empathy, both with the employer, with the community members, and also with the mother, Arcee, about her son kind of not understanding yet at the age of 6 years old exactly how the world worked. He was just an innocent, wide eyed kid who really just wanted to see Santa Claus, like every other kid in America who was 6 years old getting excited. So I will save some of our other themes, I'm sure, for later in the discussion, but I loved the clarity and the straightforwardness of the story. It was not complicated. It did not have flowery language, but it was emotionally very profound. And I've been thinking about it for the last few days. So, very glad that this made its way into our Christmas episode.
I'll give my initial impressions. I really like this story, and obviously it has a very poignant message. The subject matter is very interesting and very important. But I found some other very interesting characteristics of this story as well. Now, my very first impression is that, well, this is an initiation story. It's a classic loss of innocence or initiation story. We have Joe, this boy, I think he's 5 or 6 years old, 6 years old, I believe. He has a kind of wide-eyed innocence. And at first, I guess he's not aware of racial segregation in society. He doesn't appear to be because as they're walking by the theater the first time, I guess he sees inside the window and he mentions it to his mom, but his mom just brushes it off, saying this is a whites only theater as a kind of a matter of fact. And he says, "Oh," I believe was his response, just a simple "oh." So this is probably something he hasn't encountered before. This is my take from the story. So this is And this, of course, leads up to, he's determined to go in there, or his excitement overpowers him. He goes in there, and of course, we have this climax. Um, in this regard, the story actually reminds me of Joyce's Dubliners. The stories from an encounter, for example, in Joyce's any story in Dubliners. James Joyce was famous for this epiphany, and he had these characters. Now, this was not in America. Dubliners, of course, takes place in Dublin, but these characters are growing up in a different kind of oppressive society. There's some impression from the Catholic Church, and there's a sort of drabness of life that pervades Joyce's stories. And these are all working class people as well. And at the end, the characters have pretty much universally throughout the short stories in the Dubliners collection, they have an epiphany, and it's not a huge. It's an epiphany. A kind of realization. This term is associated with Joyce in particular, but it is usually a loss of innocence as this type, a certain awareness of how things are that kind of breaks an illusion or a romantic view of the world. And this is what's going on here, but it's different. It's subtly different than Joyce. It's similar to Joyce, I think, but it's different. So that was the first thing I thought immediately. Here's an initiation story, right? And this is where of course, his mother scolds him in a way, not scolds him, but says, "Look, you can't go in there." And the mother has accepted this segregation, right, in America, and she basically tells him this is how it is. But the ending is very interesting. Actually, there's a certain complexity in the last few lines. I want to talk about this in a bit, but first of all, I just want to say a couple other really interesting things I found about this story. Now, again, this is my first time reading Langston Hughes, and what I noticed about this story, I'm not sure if this extends to his other works, but there was something very interesting about the narration style. Now, Joyce's Dubliners, a lot of the stories are they're told retrospectively from first person narrator. In this case, we have a third person limited omniscient narrator, and that what that means. If you don't know, is that a third person is they, he, she, this kind of narrator that's out. There's not the protagonist, there's not the individual, but has access to the protagonist's head. And what's interesting about this story is it's RC's story to begin with. The narrator is in RC's head as she goes about her business, and later it shifts to become Joe's story, and the narrator is in Joe's head. So we can get a sense of their thoughts or their feelings. But what's really interesting, and I want to talk a little bit about technique, and I'll come back to this, but there's a lot of what's called a great free indirect discourse or free indirect style, which is a technique that was invented by Flaubert, I believe, in Madame Bovary. And what it does is it allows an author to write or a narrator to be in the third person, but it gives them the strength, the closeness, and the access to thoughts of the first person by blending language of the character with the blending the language of the narrator. And if you look closely, I have some great examples. This is a case study in free and direct discourse. It's very nice, very nicely done. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. I don't want to keep talking. And then again, the it had a nice plot structure too. We can look at this if we look at it in terms of things like Freytag's pyramid. We have this exposition, we have this inciting incident, this rising action, this great climax scene, and this denouement at the end. And we can really, a lot of short stories aren't really segmented like this, but I noticed that I can really kind of place this plot structure. So I mean, a lot to talk about. I really want to go back and talk a little bit more about this free and direct discourse style, which makes this story. It made it very interesting to me. It was something that I really noticed and really and thought made for a great story, despite everything else about it.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. So, what I appreciated about you bringing some of these technical aspects into the story, that, as we often say on this podcast, it's not required to know the technical details or the structure or who's the narrator or all the fancy terms. It's like, did this story work for you or not? And I think when you were talking about the free, indirect discourse, what that translated to me is, did I know what the characters were thinking? Could I understand them and connect with them with empathy? And I think the way that he chose to let the story unfold, we see the Black mother working with her employer and her employer's kids being so excited. These little white kids are so excited about Santa Claus, and they just went to town with their mom and they came back with all these presents. And the mother shortchanges the housekeeper from what she was owed. and she needed that money to buy her son's Christmas presents. And she's like, "Oh, I think she was owed 750." And the mom said, "Oh, well, I spent my extra money with my cash on Christmas Eve with my kids. Can you just take $5?" And RC says, "I really would like 750." Right? She's speaking up for what she was owed after telling us how tight her budget was, right? So she didn't have the wiggle room to say, "Oh, just give it to me next week." Where this story was written at a time, there's no debit card, there's no credit card. If you don't have cash, you've got nothing. And what was so effective, it was that tension of the housekeeper saying, "I wish my employer would have a little bit of empathy. Doesn't she think I want to do something for my kids? Doesn't she think I'm on a schedule?" It was that sort of lack of caring about another person's experience because it was so focused on the white family and their experience, a very selfish viewpoint. And what I appreciated about that is that it made me as the reader say the hopes and fears of the Black family were just like the hopes and fears of the white family, right? It was very relatable. They wanted to create a Christmas magic for their kids, but the way that they could go about it because of the society and the economic pressures that were on, they just couldn't. And when you were describing the scene of the young boy walking into that movie theater and he's like, "Oh, is that Santa? Oh my God, it's Santa." And he just walks up there to get his candy cane. And instead of the Christmas miracle of the white community that have literally excluded an entire community of people, it could have been the Christmas spirit, the Christmas miracle that the Santa Claus just handed him the candy cane. The kid was like, "Oh, Christmas magic," and then walks out. But
Yeah.
that was not the world that Langston Hughes made for us because he's like,
And,
"That was not my experience." He's
and,
like,
and that would make it for a kind of a cheesy story, right? Because that's, you know what? I have to say, like, I kind of thought that was going to happen, which means Langston Hughes, he didn't take the easy way out, right? Obviously, right? That's not the story. That would make for a different kind of story altogether, right? And this is, yeah, I think as George Saunders says in his Swim in the Pond in the Rain, it's about not taking the easy, obvious answer, right? When writing, and I think that was it. There seemed to be that expectation that, oh yes, this will save Christmas. He'll embrace little Joe, give him the candy cane, and all will be well. But of course, it's not.
and the title, Colin, takes us there. One Christmas Eve, right? It's like, "Oh, one Christmas Eve, I had Christmas miracles." It's like, well, actually, one Christmas Eve, Christmas was ruined for me forever because I realized I wasn't welcomed here and that people were cruel. And I was like, "Oh, Langston Hughes, did you really just need to stick a knife in my heart and twist it? Merry Christmas."
I
So,
don't
yeah,
know though. I don't know that though. I didn't get the same sense that it was necessarily ended in this life being ruined as pessimism. I did see it as a kind of epiphany, a wisening to the ways of the world, this particular society. But I did see that. I don't know. I want to talk about the ending. Can we jump into the ending really quick? There's something complex going on, or maybe it's just me, but I think it's more. There's more than meets the eye to the ending. Um, and in exactly what is going on. But you're right, it's not a feel-good story, that's for sure. But I don't get the sense that the boy is going to be downtrodden. His mother has dignity, right? She's accepted certain constraints in society, right? Right? But she does act with a dig. She's assertive. She says, "I would like my $7, please." Right? This is not someone who's absolutely defeated does not have assertiveness. And I noted that. That was very impressive, right? This is an exploit of society, but the mother she carried herself with a certain dignity, I noticed.
for
Although
sure.
we didn't get too much into the mother's character, it really became about Joe's experience, right? But I didn't necessarily get the sense that he was going forward crushed. He was wizened, but was he crushed by the experience?
I'm not sure if Joe was crushed, but I'm thinking that Joe is Langston Hughes, right? I like to think that writers sort of
Oh
reflect their
yeah.
experience.
Well,
So he's an adult man now, looking
yeah.
back on the beauty of being a 6-year-old kid. And the things that little Joe says, and it's repeated twice, and I'm glad you took us there to begin with. It said, "Oh," said little Joe. So when
Yeah.
his mom said, "You can't go into a white theater, it's not Baltimore, what are you thinking?" And he just said, "Oh," said little Joe.
Right.
And Langston Hughes takes that exact brief sentence and
It's been
takes
repeated.
the story out.
Yep.
So it's that moment of just, as you said, maybe acceptance, resignation,
Yep.
of just of knowing that this is how the world is.
Yep. It's a kind of stoical in a way, though. It's not like a, oh, woe is me, right? It's just a simple, oh, right? It's, oh, the boy is surprised, but he's also taking it in stride. I think, Joe. I mean, again, we have some access to him, right? And he was really upset by the Santa Claus when the Santa Claus rattles this candy cane at him like in a menacing way, and little Joe, runs from the store crying, right? He's kind of traumatized by this experience, and all the white folks in the store are laughing, like it's comical to them, right? So this is and again, that's not a Santa. That's I mean nobody that's not a that nobody with any respect acts like this, period, let alone Santa Claus, right?
He's not a
So
jolly old elf in that moment.
right.
He's a menacing racist, right?
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is though, and again, I can't help but talk about the ending here, because this all, you know what, it's like George Saunders, this is this a story yet? And it certainly is. I think as I was reading it, I really thought about this. And yeah, he has this kind of Joy style experience, right? Like a Dubliner style experience where the kid Joe is really let down. He was fantasizing about Santa Claus and being bestowed gifts or whatever, and then this Santa Claus turns out to be this ruffian, right? Who just brandishes this candy and shakes it, and that's a story in a way. But what I think really made this particular story and I mean the beauty of this particular story is the last couple lines, where the mother says, look here, you weren't supposed to go in there. And then she said that guy wasn't Santa Claus. He's just some white dude white guy in a costume or whatever. He's not the real Santa Claus would never do this. But it got me thinking. There's something interesting about this ending, and I have to read this story. I've only read it once. I have to admit, I only read it once. I got to get back to it. But my initial impression was that it's a little bit ambiguous. And I think the reason, okay, number one, yeah, that guy wasn't Santa Claus. He was just some, she called it for the theater. And it's interesting. There's a double entendre, right? This word theater is said, it literally was a theater. This is a Santa Claus hired by the theater, the movie theater, and the attached department store, whatever it is, right? But she says this is a white person's theater. But I initially read that in the other term, the theater, as in theatrics, as in as in a pantomime or something fake, right? Some put on, right? And that's what this was in a way, as well, right? Maybe I'm reading too much, but the word theater, to me, comes across as ambiguous, as having two kind of distinct meanings. But also, she says that wasn't the real Santa Claus. And it's true, it's not the real Santa Claus. But then I thought, well, there actually is no real Santa Claus either, right? Because Santa Claus is a myth, it's a construction, right? There is no Santa Claus in reality. So the mother is protecting Joe. She is saying to him at first, "You can't go in there. This is the ways of the world." But he's not the real Santa Claus. So she's being very frank with him about how things are. But then she's holding back and saying the real Santa Claus would never do this. But what is the real Santa Claus? He's an embodiment of an ideal. He doesn't exist. Santa Claus is a mythic figure, of course. It's this benevolent figure who he treats everyone justly, except for the bad kids who get coal, right? But that's justice too, right? It's justice is a very just person, and it's true. Santa Claus, the real Santa Claus, wouldn't do this. But unfortunately, in our world, there is no real Santa Claus. It's a mythic figure, right? So what does that mean? How is that portrayed? Is she protecting her son, or is there some subtle irony going on here
Yeah,
in the
Colin,
ending?
can we go back to that actual scene? I'd like to read it out loud because I think the
Yes,
word is
please.
very important. So,
We're talking about the last couple lines, right? Yeah.
yep, I'm just going to read a little section. When little Joe got his breath back on the way home, he told his mama he had been in the moving picture show. But Santa Claus didn't give me nothing, Joe said tearfully. He made a big noise at me and I runned out. Serves you right, said Arcee, trudging through the snow. You had no business in there. I told you to stay where I left you. But I seed Santa Claus in there, little Joe said, so I went in. Huh, that wasn't no Santa Claus, Arcee explained. If it was, he wouldn't have treated you like that. That's a theater for white folks. I told you once, and he's just an old white man. Oh, said little Joe. The reason that I took you there, Colin, is that I love that description But for me, when you ask the question, was the mother protecting her son from this idea of this Santa Claus who was not acting very Santa Claus-like, right? He was letting his prejudice kind of ruin this child's experience of Santa Claus by being menacing. She said in the beginning, children have so few years to believe in Santa that she really wanted to make this year special for her son. We start the story out with that framework of this mother, just like the mother of the white kids, wants to make some Christmas joy for her kids. So that was such a relatable thing. So, yes, maybe she was protecting him or helping him see the world that they were forced to live in. But her opening theory, like what she really wanted to do, was to give her kid a beautiful Christmas, just like every kid deserves to have. And so that's why I said, the knife got twisted in for me. Not that Langston Hughes, said anything particularly harsh. It was more the relatability of at that time and place, people couldn't be humane to each other. And that just really, really bothered me.
Thank you for listening to the Lit Fiction Podcast. Head over to our website at litfiction.com to check out the edited transcript of today's discussion and more literary content like essays, curated music playlists, and original artwork. And don't forget to follow us on social media at lit_fiction on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram.